Today you'll have an interview on everything we've covered so far. I'll ask a question and give you a few seconds to pause this video and try to answer it on your own. I strongly recommend you doing this out loud, so that you develop the skill. Because it's easy to imagine the answer in your head, but it's much harder to formulate it correctly. If you answer some of the questions incorrectly, or couldn't answer at all, make a note of them, so that you don't forget to review these topics later. Because I took these questions from real interviews. And that means most likely you'll encounter many of them when you start looking for a job. If your answer is different from mine, but it still conveys the correct meaning, then consider your answer is correct. No one will expect memorized or word-for-word definitions from you. Just like in a real interview, I won't ask absolutely every question from every topic. Otherwise, this would drag on for several hours. Usually a few questions are asked from different topics, and that's enough to see the candidate's level. Today the process will be exactly the same. 2 or 3 questions from one topic, then from another, and so on. So if you're ready, let's begin. Describe the class Any. The Any class is a base class for all other classes in Kotlin. All classes in Kotlin implicitly inherit from Any. Next question. What methods does the Any class provide? These are the methods equals, hashcode, and toString. Equals checks whether 2 objects are equal. Hashcode returns a numeric representation of the object, and toString returns a string representation of the object. Describe the class unit. The type unit is used as a return value of functions that don't return data. It doesn't need to be specified explicitly, because the compiler adds it automatically. And the unit is declared as an object, which means it has a single instance. Describe the class Nothing. Nothing is a subtype of absolutely all types in Kotlin. You cannot create an instance of this class, because it has a private constructor. This type is used as a return type of functions that never complete successfully. For example, functions that always throw an exception, or that contain an infinite loop without an exit condition. A common example of a function that always throws an exception is the function toDo. It's called to remind you to implement some functionality later. What's the difference between val and var? Val is short for value, meaning an immutable variable. Its value is set once and cannot be changed. Var is short for variable, in other words, a mutable variable. Its value can be reassigned. What's the difference between val and const val? Val is an immutable variable, whose value can be computed at runtime. A val property can override a getter. Also, a val property can be an instance of any type, and it can be created anywhere in the program. In constructors, methods, inside classes, etc. Const val is an immutable constant, whose value is computed at compile time. In bytecode, the constant value is substituted directly at the points where it's referenced. Constants cannot override a getter. And they can be only one of the basic types: int, float, boolean, string, and so on. Constants must also be static, meaning they can be declared either inside a companion object, as the file level outside of a class, or inside a class declared as an object, which is a singleton. What is the method hashcode and what is it used for? Hashcode is a method from the parent class Any that returns as a numeric representation of an object. It's used for fast lookup of objects in hash tables, such as hashmap or hashset. List the rules for equals and hashcode methods. In the first rule, if you override equals, you must also override hashcode. Next, if 2 objects have different hashcodes, they are definitely different. If objects are equal according to equals, their hashcodes must also be the same, but not the other way around. If 2 hashcodes are the same, it doesn't necessarily mean the objects are equal. It might be just a coincidence. What happens if you override equals, but not hashcode? It breaks the contract between equals and hashcode, which can cause the tables like hashset and hashmap to work incorrectly. In these cases, just remember how these collections work and how overriding hashcode affects them. What does the default implementation of equals return? That is, if in some class we don't override equals, we can still call it. So how will it work in this case? The default implementation of equals compares object references. It is the same as using free equal signs. The properties of the objects themselves are ignored. What access modifiers exist in Kotlin? There is a modifier public, which is the default and is available anywhere in the program. Private is only available within the declaring scope, meaning inside a class, object, or a file. Protected is available inside a class and its subclasses. And internal is available within a single module. What is the keyword object in Kotlin? Object is a keyword to create singleton objects. It's also used when creating instances of anonymous classes and companion objects. Can we use constructors when creating a singleton with the keyword object? Here the answer is short: no, it's not possible. Which delegate allows us to create an object that internally uses the singleton pattern with the double check locking. We looked at this a few lessons ago, as this delegate is called by lazy. What is the data class in Kotlin, and what are its main features? A data class is a special type of class in Kotlin designed for storing data. Under the hood, it overrides the methods toString, equals, and hashcode, and it also generates the methods copy and component n. What are the requirements for a data class? A data class must have at least one property declared in the primary constructor, as either val or var. And also a data class cannot be marked with the keyword open. Can we inherit from a data class? We covered this quite recently. The answer is no. Inheritance isn't allowed because of the component n functions. Next question: can a data class inherit from another class? We've seen plenty of examples of this in the course. The answer is yes. A data class can inherit from another class or implement interfaces, or both. Based on which properties are the methods of a data class generated? Here is the point is that in one class, properties can be declared inside the primary constructor and inside the body of the class. And the question is, which of these properties will be used to generate the methods toString, equals, hashcode, and so on? Only the fields of the primary constructor are used. The other properties are ignored in those methods. What is the latent need? Latent need is a modifier for a property that allows delaying its initialization until later, but at the same time avoiding the use of a nullable type. This modifier can only be applied to properties declared as var. How can we create a custom delegate for class properties? If a delegate is needed for read-only properties, then you need to implement the interface read-only property and implement the method getValue. If a delegate is needed for read and write, then you need to implement the interface read-write property and implement the methods getValue and setValue. Which design pattern is implemented using the interface delegation? We also looked at this recently. This pattern is called decorator, or wrapper. Lists the main differences between interfaces and abstract classes. Interfaces, unlike abstract classes, cannot contain a constructor. At the same time, a class in Kotlin can implement as many interfaces at once, but it can only inherit from one class, even if it's abstract. It's also important to understand their conceptual difference and purpose. Interfaces usually define the behavior of an object, so classes that implement them may have nothing in common with each other. For example, the interface comparable, which allows objects to be compared with each other. Strings implements this interface, but so can our student classes, numbers, and so on. So completely unrelated classes can share a specific behavior. Abstract classes serve a completely different purpose. They usually act as a parent for a family of classes with similar responsibilities. For example, the abstract class URL connection. It represents some kind of connection, and all its subclasses also represent connections: HTTP URL connection, FTP connection, and so on. Next question. What does the keyword final mean in Kotlin? If final is applied to classes, it means they cannot be inherited from. If it's applied to methods and properties, it means they cannot be overridden. You might not remember this keyword because in Kotlin it is a default behavior, so usually you don't need to specify it explicitly. What should be done to allow a method of a class to be overridden in its subclasses? You're watching a video from our Kotlin programming course. I have left a link to the full version of the course as well as the biggest discount available in the video description and in the pinned comment. Enjoy watching. If the class is not abstract, then it must be marked with the keyword open, as well as the method you want to override. If the class is abstract, then the method should be marked with abstract if there is no default implementation, or with the keyword open if there is one. What is a sealed class? It's a class with a restricted set of subclasses. All of its subclasses must be declared in the same package where the sealed class itself is declared. And this allows the compiler to know all possible options and ensures safety when, for example, using them in a when expression. If a question is marked with a star, it means we haven't explicitly covered it in the course, but don't rush to think you don't know the answer. You just need to reason it out. Recall the features of sealed classes, recall what enums are, and think how to answer it. And the question is, how do sealed classes differ from enums? Sealed classes represent a hierarchy of classes, where there is a parent and subclasses, and you can create as many instances of the subclasses as you like. Enum, on the other hand, is not a hierarchy. It's a single class in which all possible instances of the class are declared. All objects are already created, and it's impossible to create other objects of the same type outside the enum class. How can you guess the name of an element in an enum class? For that, you can access the property name. Every enum element has a name property that returns its name as a string. Can we inherit from an enum class? Again, this is a start question. We haven't discussed it, but if you know what an enum is, you can easily reason to the correct answer. No, we cannot, because that would make it possible to create other instances of this class. But for the program to work correctly, all possible instances must be declared inside the enum class. What's the difference between nested and inner classes? A nested class is a class defined inside another, but it has no access to the members of the outer class. If you don't specify any keyword, by default the class will be nested. An inner class, on the other hand, does have access to the members of the outer class, including private ones. To create the inner class, you need to add the keyword inner to it. What is the value class? A value class is a special kind of class in Kotlin that has a single property in its constructor. When compiled, it gets inlined. Instead of creating an instance of this class, its properties are used. As a result, unnecessary objects are not created, which improves performance. Into which two types are all collections in Kotlin divided? This question can be tricky because there are many types of collections: list, set, and map. But if the question is about two categories that all collections fall into, then you need to remember that absolutely all collections are either mutable or immutable, and each of them has its own interfaces. What's the difference between a set and a list? A set doesn't allow duplicates, unlike list. A list also lets you access elements by their indexes. A set has no methods for accessing by index. List the main implementations of set and their features. Hash set. Elements are stored unordered. And the complexity of operations is in the best case of 1. A linked hash set. Elements are stored in the order of insertion. And the complexity of operations is also in the best case of 1. Tree set. Elements are stored in sorted order. And the complexity of operations is in the best case of log n. What are collisions, and how are they resolved in a hash set? If two different objects are mapped to the same cell in the hash table, this is called a collision. In that case, a linked list is formed in the cell. If the number of elements in the cell exceeds a certain threshold, which is currently 8, then the linked list is replaced with a tree structure to improve performance. Because of this, in the worst case, the complexity of operations becomes O of log n. Which interface is at the top of the collection hierarchy? And what is it used for? At the top of the hierarchy is the interface iterable. It's used in the iterator pattern, so that all elements can be iterated over in a loop for or in a loop for each. That's all for the collection questions. In a real interview there might be many more. But all the most popular collection questions are in a separate video. You can find them early in the course, in the section where we studied the internal structure of collections. Let's move on to the next topics. What is the non-local return? A non-local return is when a return inside the lambda passed into a function not only returns from the lambda itself, but also from the function that called it. The definition sounds complicated, but just remember how it looks in real code. Inside the function main, we call another function, and that takes a lambda as a parameter. And if we use the return inside that lambda, then we exit not only from the lambda, but also from the main function that called it. Non-local return is supported only in inline functions. In regular functions, lambdas cannot return from outer functions using return. What is the keyword inline used for? Inline allows the body of a function to be inserted as a place where it's called, and this gives you the following advantages. First, we avoid creating unnecessary objects. Second, we can use non-local return. And third, we can use the modifier reified. What is the keyword cross-inline used for? Cross-inline is used for lambda expressions in inline functions when you need to forbid non-local return. It's usually applied when the passed function is called in a different context. For example, inside an anonymous class. What is the keyword no-inline used for? No-inline is used for functions with a modifier inline, to disable inlining for a specific lambda passed into that function. And this is most often used when you need to store the lambda and use it as an object. For example, passing it to other functions. How does inline affect memory and performance? Inlining a function with lambdas can reduce overhead by avoiding extra object creation, but it also increases the size of the final bytecode, since the body of the function is inlined at the call side. The definition sounds a bit heavy, but in practice you don't need to overcomplicate it. In an interview, you can simply say that if a function takes a lambda as a parameter, and you don't use inline, then additional objects will be created in memory. But if you declare it inline, then the function body will be inlined at the call side. And if this function is large, then the bytecode will also grow. What is type erasure? Type erasure is a process in which the type information used in generics in Kotlin is lost during compilation. As a result, the bytecode contains no information about the generic parameter types. They are all treated as the parent type object, and you cannot access them at runtime. How is the keyword reified related to type erasure? Reified allows type information to be preserved at runtime, even though normal generics lose this information because of type erasure. This keyword can only be used in inline functions. What is variance? There are many different definitions. One of the most concise and understandable ones comes from one of the creators of the C# compiler. Variance is preserving assignment compatibility of the original types in derived types. The goal here is not to reassign the perfect definition, but to be able to explain it and understand what it actually means. What are kinds of variance? There are three kinds: invariance, covariance, and contravariance. Explain invariance. Invariance means no inheritance or assignment compatibility between derived types. It's used by default if no keywords in or out are used on the parameter. Now explain covariance. Covariance is preserving assignment compatibility of the original types in derived types and in direct order. It's used when the keyword out is applied to a parameter. It should only be used in immutable classes that produce elements to the outside. In other words, act as producers. Now explain the third one, contravariance. Contravariance is preserving assignment compatibility of the original types and derived types in reverse order. So instead of a specific type, you can use either the type itself or its parent. With covariance, you can use either the original type or its children. That's why these definitions involve direct and reverse order. Contravariance is used when the keyword in is applied to a parameter. And it should only be used in mutable classes that accept elements, which means they act as consumers. What kind of variance is used in Kotlin standard collections? In mutable collections, the default is invariant. There are no int or out keywords there, while immutable collections are covariant. How are collections different from data streams? In data streams, all elements are processed sequentially by intermediate operators. In collections, all elements are first processed by the first operator, then by the second, and so on. A data stream stops working if elements are no longer needed. Intermediate operators in collections are executed regardless of whether elements are required or not. Intermediate operators in data streams are not executed unless the terminal operator is called. In collections, they are executed regardless of the presence of a terminal operator. Which terminal operator in a sequence applies an operator to each element of the stream? That would be the operator for each. How is flow different from sequence? Flow, unlike sequence, is an asynchronous data stream, and it supports working with coroutines. In flow's intermediate operators, you can call any suspend functions. In sequence, you cannot call suspend functions in intermediate operators. What is the coroutine context? Coroutine context is a set of different elements that controls the behavior and state of a coroutine. It's an object that contains several components, such as dispatcher, coroutine name, exception handler, and job. What types of dispatchers do you know, and what are their features? The dispatcher main uses a pool with a single main application thread. It's usually used when working with the user interface. The dispatcher I/O uses a cache thread pool. It's commonly used for read and write operations. And if there are no additional settings, the maximum possible number of created threads will be 64. Next is the dispatcher default. It uses a fixed thread pool, where the number of threads equals the number of processor cores, but at least 2. This dispatcher is applied by default if no other dispatcher was passed when creating coroutines in a scope, and it's usually used when you need to perform heavy computations. Then there is a dispatcher unconfined. It starts running in the current thread where the coroutine was created, and then, after suspension, it may continue execution in the thread used by the corresponding suspend function. In practice, this dispatcher is usually not used. What is the peculiarity of daemon threads? Daemon threads do not prevent the program from finishing. If all main threads are completed, the program will stop, and all daemon threads will also be cancelled. What's the difference between the coroutine builder's launch and async? Launch returns a job object. It doesn't allow you to get a result from the coroutine. Async returns a deferred object, from which you can get the coroutine result using the method await. What are the main rules of structured concurrency? The first rule is that all coroutines must be launched within a scope with a defined lifecycle. Coroutines form a hierarchy of job objects. When a parent job is cancelled, all its children are cancelled as well, and the parent job won't complete until its child coroutines have completed. Why is global scope not recommended to use? Because it violates the principles of structured concurrency and cannot be cancelled. How is a supervisor job different from a regular job? When using a regular job, if an error occurs in a coroutine, it propagates up the hierarchy to the root job, and this job and all its children are cancelled. If you use a supervisor job, then cancellation or failure in one child coroutine doesn't affect the other child coroutines. What are the differences between hot and cold flows? A hot flow emits data regardless of whether there are subscribers or not. A cold flow emits data only when there is a subscriber. With hot flows, all subscribers receive the same elements, and they are shared. With cold flows, a new data stream is created for each subscription, and subscribers receive data only from their own stream. Hot flows never finish, while cold flows end in two cases. First, if subscribers no longer need the data, and second, if there is no more data in the stream. What are the differences between shared flow and state flow? Shared flow may not contain any values. State flow always contains some value. The parameter replay defines how many elements should be delivered to new subscribers. In shared flow is 0 by default, but this value can be changed. In state flow, the parameter replay is fixed at 1 and cannot be changed. When the buffer overflows in shared flow, the default strategy is to spend, but this can be changed. In state flow, the default strategy is drop oldest, and it cannot be changed. Also, if several identical elements are emitted in a row in shared flow, no filtering will happen, unless you explicitly add the operator distinct until changed. In state flow, if duplicates appear in a row, they are filtered automatically, and only one of them remains. And since shared flow may not contain values, it doesn't have a value property. State flow always contains a value. That's why it has a value property. What can we use to solve a problem of a race condition? Here it's important to consider whether the code is organized using regular threads or coroutines. If you're talking about the span functions, then we can use the class mutex and the method with lock. If you're talking about regular functions, a synchronization block can be used. Tell what you know about how the memory works in Kotlin. In Kotlin there are two memory areas, the stack and the heap. The stack stores primitives and references to objects, and the heap stores the objects themselves. If an object in the heap cannot be reached from the stack, there are no references to it, then the garbage collector will destroy it. And this concludes the interview. I hope that you were able to answer if not all, and then at least most of the questions. I strongly recommend reviewing all the topics where you had difficulties. A list of questions and answers will be attached after this lesson. In the next lesson, we will summarize this course. See you soon!